Thank you for attending. Please be patient. We will begin our presentation very shortly. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar hosted by Nextime in association with US India Business Council and ICICI Bank in Canada. I am Mark Lessam, and I'll be your moderator. I'm a Senior Executive Director with Nextime, and I lead efforts to enhance the presence of Nextime in North America. Like many of you, I'm a business executive with operating experience across multiple functions and industries. I'd welcome meeting with any of you interested in learning more. We're pleased to launch a webinar series entitled Global Capability Centers, India as the Preferred Destination. This four-part series will cover a variety of decision-making variables related to Global Capability Centers, or GCCs. Some of these variables include optimal location, operating models, and the GCC's role as a transformation hub with technology as the backbone. As we navigate our way out of the pandemic, it made sense to begin by kicking off the series by focusing on how GCCs performed during the pandemic and the key drivers behind selecting India as a preferred destination. Now, it's my pleasure to welcome our distinguished panel, Peter Bender-Samuel, founder and CEO of the Everest Group, Peter Schumacher, who I might refer to as Peter S., who is founder and CEO of Value Leadership Group, Manoj Gidvani, Vice President, Global Marketing at Nextime. Now, I'm going to begin today with a brief contextual overview to be followed by our expert panel discussion and then your questions. We aim to conclude in 60 minutes. Before we begin, please note that you are in listen-only mode. If you have any questions, please share them with us through the question box on the control panel. We will address those questions toward the end of the session or in writing if time doesn't permit us to cover them during our broadcast. So let's kick off the presentation. Historically, GCCs were referred to as developmental centers and then global in-house centers, or GICs. Businesses benefited from lower labor expenses, which bolstered earnings due to the labor arbitrage. However, they've evolved to become today's centers of excellence, where businesses realize strategic value over time. The pandemic obviously challenged all businesses and operating GCCs alike. From the onset, business continuity plans, or BCPs, were tested. With a work from home or work from anywhere structure, organizations found sudden changes in their delivery methods. As the pandemic took hold, they adapted to manage the crisis. As an example, they doubled down on cross-training of personnel to ensure minimum interruption and enhance their operating efficiencies. The bottom line financial impact and the market expectations to deliver business as usual resulted in tremendous cost pressures. This led organizations to evaluate geographies with low-cost, highly skilled resources who could manage in-house complex functions that were traditionally treated as sacred. Critical industries such as pharma, consumer goods, financial, and many, many more saw spikes in inventory turnover due to the mass hysteria. As a result, hiring, training, and retention of skilled resources quickly became the need of the hour. Managing virtually and modifying HR policies became the norm. So thank goodness for technology solutions, as they also became a necessity. Organizations quickly adapted and implemented innovative technologies into their daily activities. Typical processes like accounts payable and receivable management were completely handled virtually. In fact, 50% of GCCs implemented or are now scaling up with the help of automation. And as the workforce went remote, they left a controlled and secure environment. As a result, organizations invested tremendous resources to train their employees and enhance their cybersecurity infrastructure. So in a recent survey of large GCCs, their overall resilience was demonstrated by the fact that 80% of them had no operational impact to their critical activities during the second wave of the pandemic. For most GCCs, Due to the speed of digital transformation and the deployment of remote business tools, absenteeism was surprisingly low, even at the peak of the crisis. In fact, about 67% of GCC leaders were confident that the remote working model will continue since there was minimal loss of productivity. Highlighting my earlier points about cost pressures and organizations shifting from their traditional internally managed sacred activities, the majority of GCCs enjoyed at least 10% growth in their portfolio of work in the past year. Finally, another recent study indicated that over half of new businesses focused on digital services delivered out of GCCs. So what's very clear from this data is that the work from anywhere policies allowed a more extensive resource pool, and this facilitated the transition of business processes, which only served to improve the overall productivity. So now let's turn to the undisputed global leader in GCC activity. India is the leading delivery location for new GCCs, accounting for more than 25% of new setups in 2020. The Indian GCC market today is estimated to be worth $36 billion in revenue and may be over $60 billion by 2025. There are over 1,430 centers employing over 1 million people. And it's interesting to note that 70% of India's GCCs belong to US headquartered companies. Fortune 500 firms account for over 180 entities, and they serve as innovation centers, meaning to say that they're more robust in their value offering than a traditional GCC. India-based GCCs continue to have a digital focus and are investing in data analytics, cloud, robotic process automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, blockchain, and Internet of Things technologies. In fact, over 500 India-based GCCs are investing in hyper-intelligent automation projects. So let's focus on the why. Why is there explosive growth in the GCC market in India? For years, India has been the preferred destination for establishing GCCs. Its dexterity in the realm of technology and fast-growing strategic relevance for global corporations have led India to emerge as a hub for sourcing services. So if we look at this graphic, we're going to work our way clockwise around it, and we'll start with talking about the talent pool. India is the second largest English-speaking population, second only to the United States. By 2025, India is estimated to deliver 600 million accessible and highly skilled workers. India has a large geographic area with very good infrastructure in Tier 1 and Tier 2 cities, and its intra-country connectivity is very well developed. The Indian government, both at the central and state levels, offer incentives that are also attractive, like policy reforms for higher research expenditure deduction, favorable tax conditions, and more. So my earlier comments focused on the shift to centers of excellence and innovation centers, but cost is always a factor, and organizations choosing India-based GCCs often save up to 45% over a period of time. Add to this mix a rapidly digitizing ecosystem, IT establishments, multifunctional back office services, and up-to-date research centers, and you can easily see why India has maintained its leadership position despite the ongoing pandemic. Its unique selling propositions are its talent pool and its cost to value equation, because India's cost structure is approximately 3 to 4 times lower than that of the US. US companies redeploy valuable resources and perform better financially when accessing GCCs in India. And it's also important to note that the number of GCCs has increased by almost 250% in the past 10 years in India, and that there are 44 global unicorns with technology centers there as of 2020. So enough of the background. Let's get right to the introductions and our panel discussion. It's my pleasure to introduce Peter Bender-Samuel, founder of the Everest Group in 1991, who serves with the vision to assist the then nascent outsourcing and global services industry. Through the executive and extensive consulting and research practices developed by the Everest Group, Peter has served numerous Fortune 500 corporations and many prestigious stakeholders. Peter Schumacher is the founder and CEO of the Value Leadership Group, a global strategic management consultancy focused on global delivery models, growth, strategy, M&A, innovation, and brand development. Peter has more than 15 years of experience working with businesses in India. Manoj Gidvani heads the global marketing at Nextime. With over 20 years of experience supporting cross-border businesses, he plays a pivotal role in service expansion and innovation. His work with global organizations spans business consulting, business establishment, greenfield, and India entry support. So thank you all for joining us. Let's get right started. I'll start, if you don't mind here, Peter Bender-Samuel, maybe you could help us kick it off and set the stage. So I'd also invite everybody to unmute themselves as we get started. So quoting from one of the Everest Group's press releases, Peter, I'll say this: India continued to be a leading delivery location for global business services market activity, accounting for more than 1/4 of the center setups in 2020, followed then by the rest of the nearshore Europe and the rest of Asia. The question then to you to kick us off is, why did global organizations select India for their GCCs?
Well, there's really three reasons. India has the deepest pool of talent, particularly when we're thinking about engineering and IT, or data science or related subjects. And so you just can't find a deeper labor pool than in India right now. And in this world of talent scarcity, particularly in North America, it's a very attractive location. But it has a very well-developed, as you pointed out, ecosystem of support, ranging from whether it's real estate, tax, but even recruiting platforms. So it's a very easy place to establish. And I think perhaps the most important, it has the deepest leadership pool. So if you're starting in a GIC, there's a deep bench of leaders you can recruit to come in and help you set that up. And I think that's perhaps the most important. So it's the lowest risk place to start a GIC.
Okay, thank you very much. And I could speak personally as well. Our clients are dealing with talent scarcity in North America at an alarmingly high level. So I could appreciate the comments there. Turning over to Peter S. Peter Schumacher, your network of global chief executives is just robust. From discussions that you've had with them, would you mind sharing your insights on the advantages that GCCs have leveraged as they've navigated the pandemic?
Sure. As you say, we speak with CXOs, decision makers all around the world, and many of them, of course, in the United States because of the significance of India for that particular market. So there are three things that CIOs in particular, those with captive centers, were concerned about when the pandemic hit. So the first thing was, can our people work from home? And the second thing was, can we keep our people healthy? And as the pandemic then progressed, a third question came up, and that was, can we manage the new surge in demand? So those were the three things that came up. Now, if you look at the first question, can you work from home? That concerns the question of broadband availability. And in India, the broadband infrastructure network has seen an incredible improvement these last 5 years, in particular led by a company called Reliance Industries. Reliance Industries is the largest industrial and most profitable company in India, and they created a next generation digital broadband network called Jio. Jio is in Hindi, it means to live. And their mission is to transform India. And that actually, anybody who's been to India a lot these last 5 years has experienced that. You could go anywhere, even into the smallest villages, and you'll find that broadband connectivity exists. So CIOs did two things. They did a survey of their people. Do you have broadband connectivity? And some actually sent some people home to check if it worked. And the conclusion was that it works. Now, the second question, can we keep our people healthy? And, India has a really good medical infrastructure, despite all the pictures that one saw on television, the US media, CNN, and so on and so forth. In particular, India has the Serum Institute in Pune, which is the largest vaccination company in the world. So vaccination has progressed very, very, very swiftly. Now, just to give you some data, I actually pulled some data. If you look at TCS, for example, because that's public data, by June 30, they had 70% of their staff was vaccinated. They had vaccinated 500,000 people, and by September 30, they're planning to have all of their staff and the staff of their employees vaccinated. So that's good news, and that actually has worked very well. And TCS is a kind of like a proxy for the industry. The other companies and the captives have performed similarly well. Now, and the third point was, can we navigate the demand? And just to put it into perspective, the demand surge was quite phenomenal. Again, using some numbers from TCS, this last quarter, their demand grew almost 25% year over year. And that's off an enormous base. That's a base of almost $25 billion of annual revenue. So on top of that, they had 25% annual growth. So that is the kind of growth that captives saw, possibly some of them. Other kinds of businesses saw, other kinds of companies saw, and that had to be navigated. So they relied really there on two things. One is, as Peter was indicating, a lot of built-up expertise, talent, availability, high talent availability, and a lot of contingency planning. So that's basically it. So those were the three challenges. The broadband, keeping people healthy, managing the surge in demand, and the good preparation and readily available talent, high quality talent, enabled this to be accomplished fairly well.
I appreciate that. Appreciate the additional research there. And both Peters, thank you for kicking us off in a successful fashion as we now dive deeper. I'm going to invite my colleague and the only one on the panel not named Peter to join us. Manoj, welcome aboard. You're an expert in providing guidance to organizations that are seeking India entry. So for those that are making that strategic move, or at least considering it, I'd love to hear what you feel the key factors are that they should evaluate before taking action. And perhaps you could also comment on how organizations like the Chamber of Commerce or embassies or consulates or any other trade organizations might assist them in their journey.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. I think the field of global expansion has the same ground rules, irrespective of where you're looking to have a presence. We did the same when we looked at an expansion in Europe as well. So we've been assisting companies for many years, and the key consideration we put across that for them to set up are four. Have a look at the regulatory, legal, and tax environment. Try to find out more about finding people, looking at how to get them, and everything to do with people. The third is with the infrastructure. And the fourth is as far as finance and compliance is concerned. Just to make a mention, the regulatory environment in India is perhaps the most friendly at this stage. Organizations looking at having a presence in India in the form of a GCC typically would fall under the automatic route, which basically means it only requires a post-investment compliance to be undertaken. People are definitely the backbone, and having the right skill sets and working with organizations who can help source people, understanding compensation, employment regulations, employment laws is extremely important. When you look at the infrastructure, not just physical, but digital is also important. And I know Peter Schumacher just talked about geo and the lease lines available, etc. It's important. It's crucial that an organization takes a deep dive into various aspects and have a complete pre-investment feasibility in place before any decision is taken with regards to their setup in India. Next Time has been laying out the red carpet to foreign investors ever since the later part of the 90s, and we continue to do so even today. We've assisted a large number of organizations for their business establishments in India. Year on year, we see at least about 100 organizations and support close to about 60 of them on an annual basis. If you look at capability centers or development centers, we were actively engaged with these organizations as early as in the 2000s. I remember somewhere around 2005, I was involved in working with a UK-based forex trading company that now has a full-fledged capability center in India. They initially viewed India as a small entity for their call center operations to support sales activities. They began with only about 10 to 12 people, but today this organization is close to about 150, and they've gone much beyond just supporting sales and marketing. They're looking at aspects related to accounting, research, reconciliations, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot that actually happens here. The GCCs that we've supported in India are mid to large sizes and not, the absolutely big ones. Coming to the ecosystem, I think for any first entrant, it's imperative to understand the regulatory, tax, and legal environment aspects in terms of how do you find people, how do you look at the right infrastructure, and so on and so forth. The ecosystem by itself is fairly large. You have insights available from credible organizations like Invest India, the USIBC, NASSCOM, partners like ICICI Bank, CBRE, and others who can provide a lot of valuable information that you would need to get in place before you actually make a decision. However, all that information is information, and you're the one who needs to take that final decision. And that decision can be taken only once you do your own proper formal feasibility in place. That would be my response.
Well, pretty thorough. I'm going to add to this just a little bit because I pay attention to it, and the government has taken initiatives. Certainly, we touched on them a little bit, but the ranking, the ease of doing business in India ranking, India has climbed up that global ease of doing business thing, and I think it helps to facilitate some of these journeys. So I appreciate your insights, Manoj. I'm going to circle back to Peter Bender-Samuel, if I don't mind. The Everest Group, Peter, you're globally respected for your research. There's no question about that, and you work across all industries. I'm wondering, from that research, if you would comment on how GCCs in India provide business continuity to their parent organizations during the pandemic, and perhaps touching on any innovative processes or technologies that have been instrumental in that.
Well, I think Peter Schumacher sort of dealt with that already fairly effectively. Look, it's been, I think, amazing just how successful the captives or GCCs have been in dealing with this extraordinary pandemic and the effects of that. It's the work from home technologies that have enabled that, and the backbone of telecom. Perhaps what we haven't dealt with is what happened next. As companies went through this, they found that they needed to lean into their digital strategies. Right? There was, the people who had advanced further down those paths were more successful during the pandemic. And I think GCCs played an amazing role in allowing firms to catch up. And the reason for that is because of the depth of technology talent in India that we're able to draw on, whereas that was hard to access in some other locations. So whether it was an automation strategy or implementing AI or other components in building out these digital platforms that people increasingly are competing on, these GCCs have been really shown their mettle in doing that. So that ability to access that broader ecosystem to make progress where where in other locations it's been difficult to has been really extraordinary.
So the digital transformation theme continues to proliferate these answers, and I think that it'll continue to do so. We'll find out here. Peter Schumacher, I'd like to get a little more granular. Out of necessity, the GCCs and their employees, they evolved through this recent disruption. And I think maybe this has also been touched on a little bit, but let's explore it deeper. To support this transformation, what specific skills or talents were needed to navigate that maybe didn't exist prior to this? And maybe are you able to offer any insight if there was a shift from maybe more traditional roles of manual processes?
Sure. So let me just highlight two things from my perspective that were decisive. And these don't get talked about a lot because typically it's always about what technology enabled this success. So one issue is the soft skills. And the other issue concerns the emotional part of the organization. This whole COVID catastrophe was extremely emotional, in particular in India, because a lot of people who work at a GCC or work at a vendor live at home, moved back at home with their parents, some were vulnerable due to age and due to other underlying conditions. So it was a very emotional. And if you want to have a successful organization, even in the best of times, you have to address the emotional issues of the organization. Just anybody who knows what the hiring process is like in India, you're not just talking to the candidate, but you're talking to the family. So the emotional part was really, really important. And the big companies really addressed that very well. They had a lot of empathy. Now, the soft skills don't just pertain to what's happening in India, but everything happening in India with the GCC is bi-directional, right? So you have somebody in the United States, somebody in Europe or in Australia with a team in India, and you have to have this trust, you have to have this mutual understanding. Of course, you have to have the technical skills, but there's a bonding that took place. So those are two things that I would focus on. Now, in terms of the talent base, what's really important is to focus not just on the talent base as it is, but how the talent base has been evolving and is likely to continue to evolve. And what does that mean in terms of practical benefits? So there are two things that I would want to highlight to people here because they typically don't get talked about, and I find them to be particularly important. So if you look at the skill base in India, it's predominantly STEM oriented, and that's a problem. That's not just a benefit. So you need to have more people who have a soft science background. And there are two developments that have taken place in the last couple of years in India. One is the National Institute of Design has been increasing the number of graduates, undergraduate, PhD, master's level, who have an understanding of design. Now, in this particular case, it was very important because design, that's also user interface, user orientation, creating compelling designs. So more responsibility was given to India, not just for the technical solution, but also for the design. So this is one of the enablers for that. And the second important enabler is the Institute for Product Leadership in Bangalore, which has been quite successful in helping educate an increasing number of Indian technologists in product management, which is a skill that has been missing in India. So if you look at a lot of the solutions that retailers, for example, with curbside pickup or quick rush to online, those were a lot of products that had to be developed, not just solutions. So in combination, the emotional appeal to keep people happy, to make sure that you show concern for them, the soft skills, the trust, mutual understanding, and then the design skills, which there are companies like Frog Design. I could talk more about them, which has a very large team in India. If you look at the caliber of people, and it's quite spectacular. And then the product leadership. So those are the things that I would say were very, very important in helping companies navigate this catastrophic situation.
Fascinating stuff. And to both Peters and Manoj already, I've learned a good deal at the strategic level, and I appreciate that. And I'm going to reserve the right to come back to strategy, but I want to turn to tactics for a second here. Manoj, you talked about the key aspects, strategic things that they might consider before entering the Indian market. Let's get a little more granular there as well. When they're setting up a GCC, what are the criteria specifically for location selection? And maybe there's some hot spots in India for the different types of GCCs or whatever you want to expand upon, but maybe a little more tactical here.
I think the criteria for selection of a location, you obviously want to go to a location that's got a developed ecosystem, and the ecosystem is relevant for your GCC per se. You definitely would look at availability of talent pool. You will look at availability of infrastructure. Again, by infrastructure, I mean the office infrastructure, SEZs, the economic zones, etc. that are available. You'll try to be in those. Accessibility to social infrastructure, I think it's important. You need to have the required hotels, restaurants, social infrastructure in terms of education, schools, colleges. If you're looking at getting your family over there, you should have that social infrastructure. that's available. The airport connectivity, that's going to be a key criteria that we look at. And you definitely would take into account what your peer network or success stories for those who have been in that particular location. I think by far, tier 1 cities in India cover all the criteria, and typically decision-making would have to be done in some point-based system that you'll have to look into. Going to the hotspots, I would say if I start from the south, Bangalore is the tech driver, and most of the known GCCs in India have their presence over there. However, Chennai and Hyderabad are prominent too. If you look at the tier 2 cities in the south, you would have cities like Kochi, Coimbatore, and Trivandrum, which are also coming up to be quite attractive. If you look at the north, we have the National Capital Region, where Gurgaon, Noida, and Delhi are pretty much the known cities that you look at having a presence in. But tier 2 cities like Jaipur and Chandigarh are also picking up a good amount of steam. If you look at the west, we have significant amount of presence in Pune and Bombay. But if you look at the tier 2s, you probably get into Vadodara, which is Baroda, and Ahmedabad, which is in the state of Gujarat. I think broadly, I think this would be the key criteria and the hotspots that I do find.
You know, you're mentioning a lot of tier 1 and tier 2. I think that serves to reinforce the earlier point made about intra-company or intra-country connectivity. That's a tough one for my mouth, but intra-country connectivity, I think, is very strong, and that supports these cities, both tier 1 and tier 2. Let's go back to strategy and maybe some research talk. And Peter Bender-Samuel, there's plenty of reporting, market research reporting on GCC ventures, certainly some of it even by sector. And I'm wondering if we can draw on your research for just a moment, and maybe you can talk about whether there are trends, that I'm sure there are, but maybe what they are in relation to industries. And when they look at establishing some GCCs, do you see anything that you can pull out and share with us?
Well, look, we've had a rapid growth across most industries. You know, we had industries that historically have not had large presence. Mostly this is about large company, small company though, right? So the large companies, the Fortune 500s, most of them have had a presence with GCCs for some time. What we're now seeing is you know, the smaller firms, the mid-size and smaller firms entering the market. And that has an industry flavor because some industries have smaller firms in them than others, for example. So I think the real story here is really about the fact that the democratization of this, it's no longer 5-10 years ago, we used to think about GCCs needing to establish 1,000 or more FTEs. That's no longer the case. There are many, many examples of 35, 50 FTE centers being very successful with a strong EBITDA return on them. So, you know, I think the story here is more around the smaller firms coming in, and that then I think has opened up to different kinds of industries that have also taken advantage of that. So, you know, and I think the reason for this explosion of smaller firms is the cost to implement a GCC, the speed at which it takes, the risk at which it takes has come dramatically down. So back to the point I made earlier, you don't need 1,000 seats. You really should be thinking about 50 to 100. And that has also caused the firms with larger presences also doing micro centers. So you've got, you know, you may have a strong presence in Gurgaon or Bangalore, but if you wanted to say do an engineering center, you know, you do a micro center around engineering, again, of 50, 100, 150 people, or data science or what have you. So I think as this industry has matured, you know, it's just become far more accessible to many, many more industries.
You know, I so appreciate that insight, because in our business, you know, I'll often approach folks and they're predisposed to thinking that they're too small to do something that could be effective for them, and that it does need to be that 1,000 or 2,000 seat center. And already we've seen that not to be the case. So I appreciate the comment. I'm going to circle back now to Manoj. Peter Schumacher, I'll come to you, I promise. But Manoj, you mentioned a lot of the different parameters, aspects, and location aspects associated with choice. And India is certainly advantageous for some of those reasons and the things that we've talked about before, infrastructure, talent, and so on. But I made the point earlier in the presentation of cost and the ability to save 45% over time. So I want to ask you this, would you say that if organizations just focus on the labor arbitrage or the cost arbitrage, that they would miss out on more favorable factors that might be offered by the Indian ecosystem?
Mm-hmm. I think I must mention over here that the cost arbitrage is a given. However, I urge all of you to take note of the learning curve as well. India has the capability to provide intelligence and not just resources. So it's just not a question of manpower. In addition, India can be considered for various centers of excellences and not just for what it is initially set up for. Just like we saw the example that Peter Bender-Samuel just gave us, they move into smaller aspects on the engineering side as well. I mentioned earlier about the example where we supported the UK-based currency trading company. It transitioned from just sales and marketing to providing a lot more functions to the parent company back in the UK. And that organization, really became big and started supporting them globally, I would say. It's important for all of us to know that, some of the key top 10 accounting networks in the world, you have at least 6 of them that have a significant amount of operations in India in the form of their own capability centers. They're doing well and hiring continuously. And I'm sure it's making a difference because it is swelling their overall bottom lines at a global level. I think the management talent is also important to bring up over here. The CEOs of various large organizations today are Indians. With the number of people you have in India, you could easily look at having stronger leaders for the organizations. And these leaders need not only look at supporting the capability centers, but they potentially could look at supporting the parent entity in whichever part of the world they may be in. I'll conclude by saying that India has a culture that is professional, international, adaptive, and seamless across geographies. The fact that these capability centers come at a competitive cost is a huge benefit that organizations need to consider.
Thank you, Manoj. I'll remind the audience, if you have questions, to please submit them through the question box on the control panel. I've got another question for Mr. Schumacher here, and then we'll jump into some of these audience questions. Peter, what guidance can you give to organizations that are evaluating India as their GCC destination? And maybe you can comment on what you think the future looks like from your perspective.
Sure. Look, when making a decision in this area, you're very future oriented. So you're not making a decision for this year, but for 3, 4, 5, 10 years into the future. And one of the things that's absolutely critical is to understand how the ecosystem is evolving and how it is different. So everybody's been talking about how India is provides a labor arbitrage benefit, which it does. But one of the things that is missing, and most people simply don't understand this, is the close-knit integration of the educational systems. There are tens of thousands of Indians who are studying in the United States. And our research, which we've been conducting these last 2 years, shows that an increasing number of them are returning to India, not as it was in the past to be close to their families, but because the job opportunities are better. And if you look at the number of Indians who hold postgraduate degrees from leading US universities and European universities, Australian universities as well, and look at where they're ending up in India, one of the things that you'll find is that at leading companies, let's say a Cisco or an Intel, roughly 10% of the employee base is made up of people of that background. But in the leadership ranks on the CXO level, It is between 40 to 80% of the people in leadership positions are people with that educational background. And at startups, it's even higher. It's almost 100%. So that clearly tells you that the market is moving up the value curve. And in one of our forums in New York, I had the president of one of the largest credit card companies in the United States, and he talked about the data analytics fraud protection unit that they've built up in Bangalore and Gurgaon. And he elaborated and said that that was the highest performing unit within that company worldwide. And in fact, the CEO of the company was a regular visitor in Bangalore, and the president was visiting once a quarter. The people working there make as much as $250,000 a year in annual income. But nonetheless, it's still a very compelling play for this particular company because they're bringing in more than $1 million a year in benefit to the company. So the market has changed. I'm not saying that you can't continue to find opportunities at the lower end of the cost curve, but it's more around value addition, value creation, than it is around finding the least expensive way to do something. So getting talent, if you want to do data science, might be a particular area of interest, or higher end analytics or machine learning, or even in autonomous driving. If you look at what's happening in the semiconductor space, these are all people who have the highest qualifications of any particular professional group of people worldwide. These are people with PhDs from Stanford, from MIT, from the University of Maryland, the University of Texas at Austin. These are really, really high performing people. So there's an opportunity to do something that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do, as opposed to doing the same thing just cheaper. I think that's one of the key points. And much of the rethinking has to happen at the executive level in the United States, in Europe, because there are too many people who are still thinking along the lines of, I'm going to go to India because I can do basic work for less. And that is kind of turning out to be a dead end at this time.
It's interesting because, and not to be a commercial for our firm, but if you look at the demographics, the educational demographics of our associates and our partners, it's also mimicking what you're talking about over time. And there's a lot of postgraduate, very, very prestigious. So I think we see the microcosm of what you're speaking about, even in our own firm. I'm going to go ahead and shift into some audience questions. And I'm going to meld a few of these together into one question as best I can, so we try and get everybody covered here. And I'm going to start with a question that I think I'll address to Manoj, but I invite Peter Bender-Samuel and Mr. Schumacher as well to comment on afterwards. I'd like to know, Manoj, what skeletons lie behind the rosy picture that the panel's already painted. Okay, so surely there's got to be some stereotypes and obstacles that have to be overcome. So the specific question is, what landmines exist that ought to be included in all these related benefits that you all are talking about? And I'll turn it over to you to ad hoc answer here.
Sure. I think I'll start with saying that the compliance regime per se is rather dense. There's a lot of paperwork, there's a lot of documentation, there's a lot of regulations that need compliance with, and that's something which can take you by surprise if you don't take that into account right at the beginning. Unlike, unlike the US and other countries in the world, an audit is mandatory for a private company in India, or even a limited liability partnership. And to a certain extent, you need to have compliances and you need a company secretary in place if you go across a particular turnover number, then share capital numbers, and it gets difficult to deal with these particular aspects. And it's better to know about these upfront rather than coming up much later. The other aspect would be the interpretation of the laws. I would say more recently, I think there was this aspect related to GST, where they started considering services to the parent company as an intermediary services and should attract GST of about 18%, irrespective of the fact that these were being exported to the parent company. Luckily, 2 days ago, a clarification came across on that particular front, and that's not there. But 18% is a huge, tax amount that suddenly comes up, and but that's settled. But there is so much of chaos at that particular point of time as to what would be the implication of this and the contingencies of that happening and not happening. I would think the other aspect to take into account is when you get work coming into India, India by itself is also looking at its own laws from data protection and privacy. And how does that fit with what you have back in Europe or back in the US is something that you must also consider. I would say these are broadly some of the points that I'll bring out. Look forward to hearing from both the Peters on how they like to add more of these.
So, look, to add to that, I think there's the biggest constraint we see is really one internal of change management. As you start up a GCC or captive, getting your own organization to understand how to use it, getting the work transferred, all those processes, that's substantial, and getting buy-in, that's a real constraint, and that takes a lot of effort and takes time. And quite frankly, those constraints are much more formidable than the ones of setting up. Your capability will be ready far before, in India, far before your ability to transfer work will be. So that's a major issue. I think tactically right now, one of the big issues that this industry is struggling with is attrition and wage inflation. Right now, we're seeing attrition exploding across the board, whether it's in a captive or in a third party. And at the same time, we're seeing wages rise very quickly. We're seeing people do wage increases ranging from 20 to 40% for existing staff. And I think that's challenging, and you need to be aware of just how hot the labor market is in India, and go in with your eyes wide open on both those issues.
Peter Schumacher, do you have anything to add? I want to come back to Mr. Samuel and Bender Samuel in the question in a minute, but.
Sure. I'm not so concerned about the wage inflation because it's always relative. There's also wage inflation happening in the United States and Europe off a much higher base. And secondly, the talent is simply not available in the United States and in Europe. So it's either the option of doing nothing or paying a slightly higher salary in India. Now, it is being misused by some people who are jumping from one company to the next. But if you look at and what we looked at 6,000 people in leadership positions across companies in India. And if you look at the top level, there's very little attrition. You have people who are with one particular company, let's say at Cisco, 15 to 20 years, or other companies, 10 years. So once you find the best talent and you nurture that talent, that talent is likely to stick around for a long time at the good companies. So there's no issue with that at all. So wage inflation is I think that's really not a big issue. I think there's an issue around infrastructure where the Indian government needs to accelerate the infrastructure build out. Infrastructure always lags. Takes a long time. Look at the flyovers in Bangalore or the metro. Takes a long time. It's been going on for 10 years. It's made a lot of progress, but it's still behind. So there needs to be an acceleration in that area. And there needs to be the educational system is changing and has been changing. I'm very optimistic about what I see. I think it could change more. Maybe one other point is to allow more non-Indian talent into the centers in India. I think that would be very beneficial and help Bangalore even become more competitive relative to Silicon Valley, let's say. So those are the things that I would say.
Thank you. I'm looking at some of these questions. I'm going to pick on Peter Bender Samuel again. Some of these questions relate to change management, which you just mentioned, and also to the size, small and medium-sized firms, which you mentioned earlier as well in your coverage. So if there's nothing to add, feel free just to say there's nothing to add. But if you have something more on the change management side, for instance, anytime I've been involved, it's often a function of getting the board on board to be able to drive cultural change. And I wonder then if there's any roadmap or time constraints or what your perception would be on how long it takes to do that. So you'd be ready from a capability perspective, you said, but maybe culturally or change management, that would be the roadblock. So if you have any sense on how long that takes, and it's probably going to be varied by the organization, but that comes across as a question. And also, if you want to elaborate any more on the small and medium-sized firms entry than you already have.
Sure. Well, two different issues. Look, typically you have board commitment when you would launch a captive or a GCC. So I agree that's helpful. Specifically, though, just because you have board doesn't mean people know how to do it or are committed to do it down in the organization. And so it takes them time to understand it. There's trust issues, there's relationships they have to build. So it's a journey. And I think I would just encourage people to approach it as a journey, right? Your real ability to get real value out of these things is building trust across organizations as you build the capability. And quite frankly, that's not a 6-month process, 9-month process, change management process. That's a several-year or multi-year journey. You just have to keep working at and keep enabling the organization to keep digging into that and building that trust. With regard to small organizations, I think this is one of the real eye-opening pieces. I touched on this earlier, but what we're seeing really is from startups on up, recognizing that they can take advantage of of a captive or a GCC. Now, historically, we've been looking at cost replacement as a driver. Increasingly in today's market, it's lack of capability in the US, North America, and perhaps in Europe. So we just can't find the talent. And so we're looking to find new sources of talent, and a GCC is a really good way to do that. And so that changes the dynamic. Now, Peter Schumacher touched on this, but it's really this inability to hire the kind of talent we have particularly in North America, and the ability to find those resources in other locations, which is driving this, which changes the texture and the velocity. So a cost replacement program, it can be slow, a lot of change management, standing up around talent scarcity. That's a much faster process, and you can get things done much quicker in that world. And I think that's what's particularly for these small to medium-sized firms. And I'll take tech startups as an example. You just can't find programmers. If you're a tech startup, you just can't find a programmer in a programming team in the United States right now. It just can't be done, right? Or at least not easily. Yeah. You can do that in Bangalore. Right, and you can set that up in Bangalore. So, and that's matriculating or exploding through the entire industry. So, I think this talent scarcity, which looks to be likely to be with us really for the next 3 to 5 years. There just simply aren't enough engineers in the world to meet the capacity, and but there's more in India than is anywhere else.
Sure.
So, I think
all right. So we're fast approaching the time, so I'll just give the audience a quick heads up. I'm going to ask one quick question of each of the Peters. Manoj, you're off for a moment here. And if we can be brief, then we'll move into your concluding remarks. And let me first start by giving Mr. Schumacher an opportunity to address the non-technology companies. So Mr. Bender-Samuel just talked about tech and not being able to find teams domestically and here in the States. What kind of non-technology companies do you typically see making these moves into GCCs?
That's an interesting, really interesting question, because it's phenomenally interesting to see how diversified the ecosystem is. And I put together just a quick list. So if you can, and I'll just start off with A. I'll just rattle through the list because I think people will find this to be interesting. So it starts off with advertising. Companies like WPP, animation and artwork, whether it's Technicolor that does animation for Hollywood movies, or whether it's designing artwork for pharmaceutical boxes, banking, financial services, bioinformatics, publishing, media, research, consumer goods, PepsiCo, Colgate, Cargill, EdTech, which is India is a real leader in EdTech, and they've got the leading position there worldwide. You got electric and autonomous vehicles, ChargePoint. People in the United States, if you've got anybody listening from the United States, they might be familiar with ChargePoint, a good small listed company. They've got a center over there. Electronics, Logitech, energy commodities trading, engineering and environmental services, companies like Bechtel, Arcadia, Aker Solutions, entertainment data services, Nielsen, gaming, which is one of my favorite areas, Zynga, Rockstar Games, IVG, healthcare, Cardinal Healthcare, just opening up a big center in Bangalore, insurance, internet, by the way, Uber, WhatsApp, Lyft, Twitter, legal services, IP protection. The list goes on. I don't know if anybody, we're only at I.
Okay, I get it.
But there are some interesting ones. Space, data, technology. I saw we had somebody in the list, agricultural technology. There's a lot of work being done in agricultural technology from space using drones. All of the leading companies are there, shipping companies, semiconductors. And one thing I just want to close in the retail space. So if you look at the retail space, you think about the retailers, right? But you've got the retailers, the online retailers, you've got the omni-channel technology companies, computer vision, frictionless checkout, franchise management software, hospitality software, point of sale software, automotive retailer like Techicon. You got last mile delivery, in-store merchandising. It's a gigantic
big list.
Ecosystem, phenomenally interesting.
Interesting response to a very simple question. So thank you. I'm going to turn to closing remarks, and I'm going to ask Peter Bender-Samuel to kick us off and to also, in his closing remarks, answer this very simple question. The question is, what's the average payback period? And maybe you'll have some insights. So if you can kick off your closing remarks and maybe touch on that, and afterwards, Mr. Schumacher and then Mr. Gidvani, and then we'll finish up.
Look, the payback is almost very quickly. So let me just give you an example. It would vary very much by what you're taking over, why you're going, how long it takes, etc. But we've got many, many use cases. An example of recent one where you have about 100 FTE that took about 18 months to put in place, cost them about $3.5 million, created first year fully running, created 5 million EBITDA. So the numbers get actually stupefying pretty quickly. So anyone who kind of does this, I think you can overdo the EBITDA analysis. They get to, the real question is how long and what you're doing, the change management issues. I think almost everyone finds them to be strong payback very quickly.
Thank you. Do you have any other closing remarks you want to leave us with?
I think to emphasize that, look, India is the most mature location that we have for these GCCs or captives. They're really being democratized very quickly. There's a very robust and deep ecosystem there to help people set them up, and the risk for doing so has been dramatically reduced over the last 5 years. It is almost inconceivable that we won't see a huge adoption in the smaller to mid-sized firms as they come to understand the potential for what they can get in the return they get.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, I can just reiterate what Peter said. So particularly on the high end, and I hope I didn't scare anybody, but if you're looking at establishing something in Silicon Valley versus, or in Austin, Texas, for that matter, as opposed to Bangalore, you want to set up a 100-person center in Silicon Valley, you're potentially looking at 75 million, 100 million a year, maybe over 10 years. You're talking about $1 billion, and you could get, you can do 90% of what you can do in Silicon Valley in Bangalore for probably a third the cost. So if you want to take, really evaluate this more carefully, I'd say take a look at it's strategic, take a look at the talent base, take a look at the kind of companies that are there. And there are thousands of them in every little pocket and niche that you can imagine. And not just US companies, Chinese companies, South Korean companies, Malaysian companies, Singapore companies, and they're all going there for different reasons, by the way. They're not going there for cost, they're going there for the talent. So take a look at the different kinds of companies. And then most of all, as Peter has also been focusing on, look at what are the drivers of creating a high performance, globally distributed organization. That is really critical, and that's often overlooked. So that is the key thing. The change starts in the mind, so those should be the areas that you focus on.
Thank you. Manoj, over to you.
I think my concluding remark is fairly straightforward. Act now. Let India give you the leverage. Diversify to differentiate. Think India, think next. Thank you.
Thank you. And this does conclude our Q&A session, but don't leave just yet, audience. Hang on for just a moment, because we do have 3 remaining webinars in this series. The next one is on October 13th, and that will include discussions on the operating models of GCCs. And you can see on the screen the other ones. So please take the opportunity to register. While we looked at pandemic response in this series and this broadcast today, we're going to be looking forward, going forward. So hopefully you'll join us. I'd like to extend a very heartfelt thank you to everybody. First to you, our listeners from across the world, and I mean that, you are listening from across the world. To our guests, Peter, and Manoj, for your insightful contributions. I would tell you that you are all terrific. I mean, I learned, therefore, I know everybody has something to take away from this, and that's really the objective. To USIBC and ICICI Bank Canada for your support at this event, and also to my colleagues and team at Next Time for working behind the scenes to make this and our future events also very successful. So we'd like to invite all listeners to connect with us to discuss how Next Time can work hand in hand with you and your organization. If you have any questions in line with today's discussion that we were unable to address due to our time constraints, please reach out to us at thinknext@nexttime.com, and our team will be happy to respond offline. Across the globe, as Manoj just said, we do think next at Next Time, and we invite you to do the same. We welcome your feedback on today's presentation. Be vigilant, stay safe. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank you now.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.